along today. It's going to be an interactive lecture. So the handout you've got also has some post-it notes. So if you could get a pen out to in between fill in bits, and we'll post it up there. So I've been working on the Reformation for the quincentenary in 2017 of the publication of the 95 Theses. And this has really linked to my engagement with translation as somebody not from the UK working in British education. So I've been thinking really what Bible translation has to tell us for translation studies on a wider context. And when preparing for this, it occurred to me that really there are different Bible translation phases which repeat in a way the movement. So the woodcut, which I've used as title page, is meant to show Jerome in his study by Dürer, but it could as well be Luther sitting in the study, surrounded by the different sources. So I'm going to look today on 3 attempts of how to translate the Bible, and I'll start with Jerome's answer, then look at Luther's answer, and then continue to one of the newest attempts of finding a solution of how to translate the Bible in the 2006 Bible, Die Bibel in gerechter Sprache. But before I go into Jerome, I would like you to write on the purple post-it note your with the original languages, all right? In as many different ways as possible. Look at the Greek text and redo it from scratch, all right? Make it simple and accessible to the largest and most diverse audience possible. Yeah. In many different ways, for many different audiences' needs. All right, so we have a Grace answer. So this is law and this is Grace. With an understanding of both source and target language and culture, so it's sensitive and well thought through. Great. Oh, yeah. Depends on the intended audience, conceptually, with annotation, beautifully. Well done. Yeah. In letter and in spirit. As a literary scholar, I would say there's no appropriate or even possible. As a believer, I would say it's being alert to the different resonances and contexts. Philologically. Maybe you shouldn't. Everyone will always read their own meaning agenda into it. Translated in binary language. I just was in Bamberg at an exhibition of modern art interacting with medieval art in the treasure house of the cathedral, and they had a notice board for hymns and psalms with the hymns written out in binary code, which was nearly impossible. Well, there's some hope still. Carefully. At the People's Vote March last time round, I went with a colleague, Charlie Laus, who is also a translator, and his 8-year-old daughter, and she had made a poster which read just be sensible. And I thought that captured it beautifully. However, feels right on the day. Last one. Meaning, not literal. So it's the old question how to get from A to B, shipping across the content. And the first thing to be aware of is actually that there is a lot of translation contained within the Bible. So it's not the Bible. It's I've color-coded the different languages. So within the Jewish Bible or the for the Christians, the Old Testament, you have Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and you have actually a couple of books which pretend to be translations and aren't. So the book of Judith was written in translatonese. It was written in the Greek developed by the Septuagint translators. So it uses phrases that had become a staple of how to translate. And it was only really determined that it's a translation and that it's not a translation but originally written work. I think 10 years ago, when both a Jewish scholar, Deborah Levy from Jerusalem, who looked at things that couldn't be back translated in Hebrew. So they only work if they are written in Greek. So Septuagint always translate the god Zebaoth, which literally means the god of armies, as the god who destroys armies. So you have the Greek expression, the god who destroys armies, in the Septuagint, but if you would translate it back into the Lord of Hosts, the meaning of the chapter wouldn't work. So you have translation going on within the Bible, and you obviously have a time span of several hundred, if not thousand, years going on. You have, in which language would the angel have spoken to Mary was a discussion in the Reformation period. So which language? German. He or they would probably have spoken Aramaic, as would have Jesus and the apostles. So you have in the Greek New Testament a translated document, and some do it better, some do it worse. So Luke is a master craftsman, Mark is rather poorly, it's a kind of Denglish of the time. So you have the Aramaic looking through and very simple structure. So the first translation I'm looking at as a programmatic translation is Jerome's version, for which he was commissioned to have a unified text for the whole church and not a kind of a Wildwuchs everybody was translating, and where they were translating from the early forms of the Itala, where from in the Vetus Latina was from the Septuagint, so they were translating in a second degree. And that seems to always be the trigger for really a thorough translation revision. It's also the trigger for Luther, so to go back to the original sources, so to cut through the double layer of translation and go back to the Hebraica Veritas, the truth of the Hebrew, which led to some complications for Jerome. So, for example, the book of Judith I mentioned, he tried to find a Hebrew manuscript. Of course, he couldn't find one because there was never one. So he went for the only Hebrew text he could find, which was a edited down version as a legend. So the book of Judith in the Vulgate is translated from this later Jewish legend source, which is a third shorter than the Septuagint, which would have been the original. So the Hebrew truth did end up in producing a less faithful text than if he had gone for what looked like a translation. And he also tries to navigate between the sense for sense and the word for word translation. So in his secular works, he advocates translating like an orator. So as you would if deliver a speech, so he translated Greek speeches and that. But he argued that for the Bible, even in the order of words, there might be a mystical meaning, so you shouldn't go for a literal you shouldn't go for idiomatic free translation. The problem is he doesn't match his deeds with his words. So if you look across the Vulgate, the bits which he translates literally are those he didn't care about, but he, so for example, the book of Judith, which he didn't have want in the Bible, but was pressed to include. So there you have a really ghastly translation. The same applies to the Song of Songs, which he thought very problematic. So, and he didn't want it to be too sexy. So he produced a kind of interlinear version which destroys all of the poetic beauty of that. While for the Gospels and for the canonical books of the Old Testament, he betters even in a rhetorical sense the Gospels, while he proclaims in his prefaces to the different books that he was doing it word for word because it was imbued with sacred meaning. So you see a translation program that is at odds with the translation practice, because the translation program is something theologically inspired, while the translation process is something that is governed by pragmatics. And he's problematizing, you probably know the famous episode he relates that he has a vision of coming to the gate of heaven, and the angel guarding the door asks him, "Who are you?" And he says, "Christianus sum." And the angel answers, "No, Ciceronianus is, non Christianus. You are Ciceronian, you are much too wedded to showing off your brilliant rhetoric than to be a truthful Christian." So that is the tension set up by him. But while he was really looking to reinstill the Hebrew into the Bible by circumventing the Septuagint and going directly back to the sources, but he becomes the de facto new original. So from Jerome onward up to Luther, this becomes the primary text for Bible translation. So, and the interesting thing is that actually also his prefaces to the books, in which he frames each of these translation strategies, become part of the canonical text. So all Bible manuscripts of the Middle Ages will have his prefaces, and in the Wycliffite Bible, for example, his prefaces are translated together with the books, which then leads to rather comic effects in some cases, because his literal translations weren't understandable at all. I mentioned how Ghastly had translated Judith, which, as you remember, was done from the Hebrew short version. So he has this bit about where Holofernes' head is cut off, that she cut off, she hit twice, cut off his head, and took the conopeum, and he hadn't bothered to translate that word, which is a mosquito net, which was hanging in the tent. And then Judith evolvit corpus eius truncum, so the truncated body, but it's constructed in a way that it's not really clear how truncum relates to corpus. So the German translator of the 15th century tried to figure out what she could have taken from the tent, and thought conopeum sounds slightly like cushion, and it's also something that you would find in a bedchamber. So he makes it into a kissen, and translates word for word, wälzet seinen Lieb den Stamm, the trunk. And you see the illustrator then takes its cue from the translation and has Judith put the head of Holofernes in a cushion cover, blue and white striped cushion cover. So that's the consequence of bad translation. What changes, what are the conditions for Luther then to start his translation process? So he couldn't have done it without the material advances in production methods. And that is, in the first instance, the availability of cheap writing material, with the first paper mill in Germany being set up in the late 14th century. And then the other technical invention, the printing, which breaks even more or less from the 1480s, so it becomes a profitable business. And Luther, in a way, is the first, not digital native, but print native generation that comes through and plays on that. And then in religious terms, we heard about the modern devout in Rodelinde's paper, but also a literary explosion of more text being produced and a much wider percentage of the population being literate. So if you want to make an impact with your views of the Bible, how do you do it? You don't do it by taking a hammer. You take it you take a printing press. So this is a replica we did with the history of book students, typesetting the 95 Theses. They were probably never put up on a door, definitely never nailed. Luther couldn't use a hammer; his life depended on it, or was his wife had to do it. They were sent by mail order to the bishop, and they were produced to be read in a wide context. And probably if he had had blue tack, he might have managed. So Luther uses the opportunities afforded by printing, and starts printing his new views of Scripture at the same time as he publishes his theological articles. He couldn't have done it without a year before he was publishing the thesis, the Revised New Testament by Erasmus, being published, because Luther's battle cry back to the sources was stronger than his ability to read these sources. His Greek was tolerable, his Hebrew was rather crap, so he relied on a team effort to do that. And he translated the New Testament in one go on the Waldburg, as you probably will know, and had with him just Erasmus edition, for which he had produced a new Latin translation of his reconstructed Greek Testament. So this translation is actually what sets up Luther's German translation, because without this philologically correct translation into Latin of the Greek New Testament, he wouldn't have been able to negotiate the text. And so he combines three movements. The translating a bit combined with getting everything into print as quickly as possible, but also singing. So he writes while he is translating the Bible, he is also producing hymns based on the biblical text. So his first hymns are psalm paraphrases, and then he writes theological hymns based on also the New Testament. So he has a increasing outreach potential to reaching first with a Latin thesis the academic public, then with a German Bible translation or the reading public, and then with a versification in the hymns, also the illiterate people. And just as an aside, it sparks off the English movement, in that Coverdale not just uses Luther's translation when he is revising Tyndale's translation of the Bible, but also is translating at the same time Luther's hymns into English. And so he is framing his old Bible translation with, through this dichotomy of the Old Testament and as a time of law and God's wrath. You see him sending down death on the camp of the Egypts until they erect the serpent, and New Testament grace. So you see grace coming down in the form of a lighting beam towards Mary, who is receiving the Annunciation directly from Christ. And you have more elements here. Adam is chased towards the flames of hell. Here, Adam is redeemed by looking up at the cross. So Luther goes back to these the original languages and incorporates philological notes on the translation in his work. So you have, for example, for the word gebenedite, which he uses for benedicere, an explanation, das ist auf Deutsch du Hochgelobte. And he also explains theological concepts behind it. This isn't uncontested, because the challenge is that, especially in the New Testament, or the contention that the conservatives in the church have is he is using translation to introduce his theological concepts into the Bible, and particularly around the concept of grace. So the trigger that then moves, produces this Sendbrief vom Dolmetschen is that he has been accused of introducing a new word by grace alone, the nur, allein aus Gnade, into his translation of Romans. So he starts a counterattack by saying that his critics haven't understood the first principles of translations, and that it's to be idiomatic, so that his introductions of new words aren't occasioned by theology, they are occasioned by language choices. And we'll test his hypothesis or his contention in a moment. I just thought I would read you for fun in the original German version the passage about the Annunciation to Mary, which you also have on your handout, but you should be able to read from the screen as you prefer. So he picks an example which he knew will rile his critics. So if you wanted to get them really angry, it's like stepping into a hornet's nest with something. So he takes the Magnificat, or the greeting of the, sorry, not the Magnificat, the Annunciation, und says, Item, da der Engel Mariam grüßet und spricht, gegrüßet seist du, Maria, voll Gnaden, der Herr mit dir. Wohlan, so ist's bisher schlecht den lateinischen Buchstaben nach verdeutschet. Sage mir aber, ob soll's auch gut Deutsch sei. Wo redet der Deutschmann also, du bist voll Gnaden? Und welcher Deutscher versteht, was gesagt sei, voll Gnaden? Er muss denken an ein Fass voll Bier oder Beutel voll Geldes. Darum habe ich's verdeutscht, du Holdselige, damit doch ein Deutscher desto mehr hinzu kann denken, was der Engel meinet mit seinem Gruß. Aber hier wollen die Papisten toll werden über mich, dass ich den englischen Gruß verderbet habe, wiewohl ich dennoch damit nicht das beste Deutsch habe getroffen. So, he tries to destroy the translation as being or coming up with a different form of image, namely the barrel full of beer. But what actually would have been associated with being voll Gnade, full of grace, would be an image like that of the Shrine Madonna where Mary is actually the container, not of beer, but of the Trinity. And that's a concept he doesn't want. He doesn't want a human being pre-instated with this power. He wants the grace to come like that as an active process from God. So, but obviously he formulates it in the most offensive possible way. So, and so then he puts his interpretation up. Und hätte ich das beste Deutsch hier sollen nehmen und den Gruß also verdeutschen: Gott grüße dich, liebe Maria. Denn so viel will der Engel sagen, und so würde er geredet haben, wenn er hätte wollen, sie deutsch grüßen. Ich halte, sie sollten sich wohl selbst erhängt haben vor großer Andacht zu der lieben Maria, dass ich den Gruß so zunichte gemacht hätte. So his key point is you have to translate as if it was happening here and now in German, and the angel is meeting Mary in a German Stube with wood paneling, no Near Eastern impression. Aber was frage ich danach? Sie toben oder rasen. Ich will nicht wehren, dass sie verdeutschen, was sie wollen. Ich will aber auch verdeutschen, nicht wie sie wollen, sondern wie ich will. Wer es nicht haben will, der lass mir stehen und halt seine Meisterschaft bei sich. Denn ich will ihr weder sehen noch hören. Sie dürfen für mein Dolmetschen nicht Antwort geben noch Rechenschaft tun. Das hörst du wohl. Ich will sagen, du holdselige Maria, du liebe Maria, und lass sie sagen, du voll Gnaden Maria. Wer Deutsch kann, der weiß wohl, welch ein herzlich fein Wort das ist. Die liebe Maria, der lieb Gott, der liebe Kaiser, der liebe Fürst, der lieb Mann, das liebe Kind. Und weiß nicht, ob man das Wort Liebe auch so herzlich und genugsam in lateinischer oder anderen Sprachen reden mög, das also dringe und klinge ins Herz durch alle Sinne, wie es tut in unserer Sprache. Denn ich halt St. Lukas als ein Meister in hebräischer und griechischer Sprache, hab das hebräische Wort, so der Engel gebraucht, will mit dem griechischen Kecharitomeni treffen und deutlich geben. Und denkt mir, der Engel Gabriel habe mit Maria geredet, wie er mit Daniel redet, und nennet ihn Hamudot und Ish Hamudot, vir desiderorum. Das ist du lieber Daniel. Denn das ist Gabrieles Weise zu reden, wie wir im Daniel sehen. Wenn ich nur den Buchstaben nach aus der Eselkunst sollte das Engelswort verdeutschen, müsste ich also sagen, Daniel, du Mann der Begierungen, oder Daniel, du Mann der Lüste. Oh, das wäre schön deutsch. Ein deutscher Mann hört wohl, dass Mann, Lüste oder Begierige deutsche Wort sind, wiewohl es nicht eitel reine deutsche Wort sind, sondern Lust und Begier wären wohl besser. Aber wenn sie so zusammengefasst werden, du Mann der Begierungen, so weiß kein Deutscher, was gesagt ist. Denkt, dass Daniel vielleicht voll böser Lust stecke. Das hieße denn fein gedolmetscht. Darum muss ich hier die Buchstaben fahren lassen und forschen, wie der deutsche Mann solches redet, welches der hebräische Mann Ishamudot redet. So that's where I took my title quote from, the Buchstaben fahren lassen. Let go of the letters. So finde ich, dass der deutsche Mann also spricht. Du lieber Daniel, du liebe Maria, oder du holdselige Magd, du mädliche Jungfrau, du zartes Weib und dergleichen. Denn wer dolmetschen will, muss große Vorrat von Wörtern haben, dass er die wohl könne haben, wo eins an allen Orten nicht lauten will. I've put up here, so I taught a Newcastle translation theory, and they were always using the Western translation theory reader by Douglas Robinson. And Douglas Robinson, I think, went slightly over the top in his translation of the passage, but he did it just in order to make super clear the point that Luther is also exaggerating. So he says, pretty wonderful translation, huh? If I let the letters go their merry way and try to determine what the Hebrew speaker meant by Ish Hamudot, I find that the true meaning is something like, Dan, my man, sweet Mary, June, honey, you great, big, gorgeous hunk of a man, and the like. You see, the translator has to store up lots of words, so he'll all have plenty to choose from if one doesn't always sound right. I still prefer Howard Jones' translation, which I think is a bit more true to the word for studying, but just to give you the register of this. So, now over to you. I've put that I would ask you to write down one version of the Annunciation to Mary, which you either would find yourself appropriate or in a different language, trying to figure out which tradition this is coming from. So I've just put up here King James and Coverdale as two English language options, but you're welcome. I'll give you 3 minutes to Google any other Good News Bible or whatsoever, or come up with your own translation. You should have the 4 options set out to you, because if you look inside, I've given an interlinear version of the Greek, and so you can write your translation on the right-hand side in the lines provided.